dealers, as well as kind of token classification. So how do you tell if a token is regulated like a security or like a commodity? What are the key provisions of that legislation from your perspective, and what steps are needed to make sure that market structure legislation is successful?
Well, look, I mean, the industry needs clarity, like any other space. If we want folks to innovate here, they can't be fearful that when they walk into the SEC and pitch something that they're going to be writing their Wells notice before they can get on the elevator. This is a completely different environment in which folks have been operating in over the course of the last decade. Our interagency actors in the working group are begging us to tell industry folks, come in, pitch us new ideas, let's innovate here onshore. And our message to folks that have gone offshore is welcome home, truly. We want you here in the United States. We want you building here. We want you creating new things. And I can speak on behalf of all of our interagency actors in the working group that are encouraging and fostering this innovation. With market structure, what we're able to do is provide that clear regulatory authority that's necessary for folks to build. That's, what is a security, what is a commodity, where is the line, who has regulatory authority over what you're building. That's extremely important. And then, if you want to pitch something new, we need to have the flexibility to be able to offer insights as to how you do that here and have access to US capital markets. At the end of the day, if you want to be the crypto capital of the world, you need folks innovating here, you need folks IPOing here. We want that innovation staying right here in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, I think Bitcoin has long probably had clarification when it comes to that delineation between a security or commodity, but a lot of the rest of the industry hasn't had that. And that doesn't mean that more clarity for the rest of the industry doesn't also benefit Bitcoin, because again, right, creating a regulatory framework that is going to help push against scams and frauds and everything like that should lift the entire community and the entire digital asset ecosystem.
Maybe I'll jump right in and just add one quick thought on that. I think that Chairman Hill and the Financial Services Committee has done an excellent job in his leadership in pushing for market structure legislation. I would say, as we think about what market structure legislation should look like, pardon? As we think about what market structure legislation should look like, we should remember sort of the core innovations of Bitcoin, the core innovations of decentralized finance, because we do have different elements. So if you think about traditional market structure, it's typically relied on sort of this principal to agent relationship. And what we have is a different innovation, different technological innovation, where we're moving and we should be more accepting of sort of this principal to principal relationship that is different, it's unique, and it has different challenges and different opportunities. So we're actively working, as Bo said, on an interagency process, trying to formulate the best ideas for that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So Tyler, maybe back to you. How do you think that market structure, legislation could accelerate Bitcoin adoption? I know that one of the things that will be covered there is kind of regulating on-ramps and off-ramps. Again, creating more connective tissue with the legacy financial system, the banking system, which could stand to benefit Bitcoin adoption. What do you think about that?
Well, I kind of think it's a rising tide lifts all boats. And a couple of years ago, the industry had spent so much time and energy advocating for the ETP marketplace in the U.S. And what we saw is very quickly afterwards, there was a institutional adoption that happened for Bitcoin. And I think it will be the same thing in the United States if we have market structure legislation and if we have stablecoin legislation, a sound regulatory regime that invites the industry to create and innovate in the United States is what we want, and that's what our job is.
Yeah, totally agree. So Bo, maybe to you, I think Tyler mentioned this a little bit. I think one of the defining principles of Bitcoin, right, is the fact that it created this decentralized blockchain and a digital asset that is associated with it, and that threshold of decentralization, the question of these systems operating without human control is a really kind of key linchpin of market structure legislation. Trying to basically set a goal for other digital assets and ecosystems to operate in the way that Bitcoin does. What do you think about the importance of kind of decentralization control and how it plays a role in the market structure legislation?
Well, it's immensely important, and this is the line that folks have been trying to draw for quite some time in the space, right? I mean, Bitcoin is truly the golden standard, and that's why we say Bitcoin is digital gold. We make no bones about that, and I've said repeatedly As the United States, we want as much of it as we can possibly get. That's why we created the SBR in the way that we've done. We recognized it for being unique. Obviously, it's a commodity, not a security. Has intrinsic stored value. As David likes to say, it has the immaculate conception, right? This is an asset that we should be harnessing on behalf of the American people, and we're working diligently as a working group to figure out those budget-neutral ways in which we can accumulate more. And I always tell journalists that ask me all the time, how much do you want? Again, I'll say repeatedly here today, that's a very silly question. We want as much as we can possibly get, and I'll say it ad nauseum the rest of the time that I'm here. But I think that we showed that we recognized that for being unique in the way that we set up the strategic Bitcoin reserve, we have the digital assets national stockpile, which is different. And in this SBR, we said two things. One, we want to accumulate more, and two, we're not going to sell any Bitcoin that we possibly have in U.S. government, period.
So turning back to the bipartisanship discussion, I mean, obviously, I do think that the crypto is one of the most bipartisan issues in D.C. at the moment, but obviously it is not totally bipartisan, and there are some voices on both sides of the aisle that seek to try and make it a little bit more partisan. How do you all view that? How do you view the challenge in navigating the partisanship that might exist in certain pockets? And do you think it's a good goal to try and keep things bipartisan?
Well, it is a commodity in Washington, bipartisanship, so I don't think we should overlook that. I think if you want durable law, you have to have it. And we've seen, 16 and 18 senators on the Democratic side that supported the Genius Act on the cloture votes last week. So, that shouldn't be scoffed at by any stretch. That's quite a big bipartisan vote, and I expect that it will only increase. And I think part of it is a little bit of momentum. You have to put a win on the scoreboard and move forward. And a lot of it is still an education phase. So as people learn more, as congressional members and senators learn more about stable coins and learn more about programmable money on the internet, the more they get interested in Bitcoin, the more they get interested in other digital assets. So I think it's a little bit of an inertia. You have to, push the stone and see how far you can let it roll.
I think Tyler mentioned something that's extremely important here. In terms of garnering partisan support, or bipartisan support, excuse me, it's more or less an education process. And that's one thing that we've run into repeatedly, is a lot of these legislators still don't understand the space. They're not living it and breathing it every day like many of us are. And so I think that when they start to recognize, one, the power of Bitcoin, the power of this blockchain, moreover, the power of what's being built in other ecosystems, maybe not at the same decentralization standard, but there's still good technology coming out of other places in the space. It helps them understand how important this is for the American people, how important it is for us to lead the charge globally in harnessing this technology, plugging it into our current ecosystems, and really revolutionizing our financial system for decades to come. And as we start having these conversations more and more, you start seeing more of our Democratic colleagues come on. And I'll say again, this should be the least partisan effort that possibly exists in this Congress. I think that folks are recognizing that. It makes me extremely optimistic about what's to come, not only with Genius and stablecoin legislation, but with market structure moreover. And then enshrining the SBR into law is going to be next.
Amazing. Bo, maybe asking you a little bit about President Trump. We will hear from Vice President J.D. Vance tomorrow. But what do you hear from President Trump about crypto and about Bitcoin? We've seen him speak at crypto events before. Can you give us an inside scoop on what he thinks and cares about most?
Well, he certainly recognizes how important it is for the United States to lead the globe in terms of, one, being the Bitcoin superpower, and two, being the crypto capital of the world. I mean, he's said that repeatedly. The president cares deeply about this space. He's made it a priority from the very beginning. He signed an executive order on digital assets on day 3. He created the Digital Assets Working Group, in which he's created a streamlined process for us to innovate, for us to put out fires, for us to allow us to foster an environment that leads to innovation here and welcome back those folks that have left our shores. He established the first AI and crypto czar. He established the first position in the White House on the Crypto Council and the executive director, which is myself. Tyler's the counselor now to the Treasury Secretary on digital assets. I mean, he is showing real force and real momentum here, and he's absolutely serious about delivering on his promises. I think that we've done a lot of that thus far. These legislative priorities will act as the backstop, and we'll clean the rest up through interagency activity. But we can't thank the president enough for his leadership. Without him, we would not be here today. This environment would not be what it is today, and Bitcoin would not be having the success it is right now without his leadership. So we're immensely thankful for him.
That's great. Tyler, maybe just to ask you the same question with respect to Secretary Besson. I know that he's been speaking a lot about digital assets recently. What is your views about his inside views about the industry?
Yeah, I mean, as you said yesterday on TV, we're going big on digital assets. And I think, moreover, if you look at his career, he's been a macro investor, macro thinker his entire career. And I think, as he thinks about how we've lost track in the United States of leadership on innovation, leadership on Bitcoin, leadership in digital assets, it's a strategic error. And so now we're in the process of re-underwriting that and bringing it back on shore. So I think that's sort of his worldview about it.
Yeah, that's great. So I know that both of you have now been in DC working on with the industry for several months. I know that it's been a whirlwind. You've been meeting with tons of different entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, investors, all sorts of industry actors. What concerns are you hearing from the Bitcoin community and the industry more broadly about what they're looking for from a regulatory perspective and policy wise? I know, Bo, when you started kind of saying that first was kind of deconstructing all of the damage that had been done over the course of the last 4 years. But what are you hearing from the community more broadly?
Look, I kind of view my role in the White House as almost being an administrator and/or Sherpa between White House policy, industry, interagency activity, and what's happening on Capitol Hill. So the president's given us broad authority to solicit feedback from industry players. I've probably had no less than 250 meetings with different industry folks over the course of the last 5 months. Both big and small, Goliaths in the space to startups. We want to hear from everyone. What challenges are they dealing with? What can we do to foster a better environment for them to build here? What can we do for Bitcoiners? What can we do for this environment? And I think that right now there's just a lot of optimism and hope that wasn't there a year ago. And that's a very exciting thing. We want to continue to foster that, continue to innovate. I think with crypto, we have very clear objectives of what we need to accomplish. We need to protect self-custody as one, protect the rights of privacy to people. We need to make sure that we're creating an environment which people have that clear regulatory authority so that they can innovate. And we need to create a backstop that's lasting. And we do that on Capitol Hill through legislation. So I'm immensely confident we're going to deliver on the president's priorities before August recess. We're going to have the most robust and clear regulatory environment that exists in the world as it pertains to digital assets. And you'll certainly see the United States stepping out as the Bitcoin superpower of the world.
Amazing. Tyler, how about you?
I think I've done just as many meetings as Bo, if not slightly less maybe. But I would say, at Treasury we have an open door policy, so we hear all sorts of commentary. We've spent a lot of time working on illicit finance matters. We spent a lot of time working on tax policy issues that affect Bitcoin miners and affect different participants in the ecosystem. We spent a lot of time thinking about how do we onshore activities and entities that have been pushed offshore over the years. So, everything from banking to market structure, the whole 9 yards, we think about it and we're trying to get smart on it because we ultimately have to write on it and put it in this report that I mentioned earlier. So I would say to the audience, the message is if you're in Washington and want to come see us, it's an open door invitation.
All right, that's great. So now that we've kind of heard what you guys are doing, I guess the question becomes, what should we do? What should the larger, broader community do to help kind of with these efforts and move things forward?
Well, tell your legislators why this is so important for you. I mean, that makes our job a lot easier as we go through this legislative process and we try to mend the gap between, just the education gap that exists in terms of helping folks understand why this is so important to the United States. I think that these legislators hearing from their constituents, hearing from industry is extremely important and powerful. And we saw that with the Genius Act. This was the first time that all of industry came together to support a piece of legislation, and we were able to push it home and do it in a bipartisan way. So we need to keep that momentum forward going into market structure, and we need to keep that momentum forward into enshrining the SBR through congressional activity, and we'll be in a great place.
Yeah, I would echo that. Just help us keep the momentum going.
All right, well, with that, I think we're at time. I think for everyone here, I hope that this conversation gave you a sense of why, there's reason for optimism. I like to tell people that I'm more optimistic now about, the chances of getting, successful policy and regulatory clarity in place than I've ever been in my time in this space, and this is part of the reason why. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
God bless you all.
Thank you guys so much for an incredible fireside chat.
to the Bitcoin Magazine News Desk presented by Mara. We're live at Bitcoin 2025. You just heard from Bo Hines, White House Digital Asset Advisor, and Tyler Williams of the Department of Treasury talking about the United States' embrace of Bitcoin and digital assets. You're about to hear Vlad Tenev, CEO of Robinhood. Before that, we've got a packed panel here to continue the discussion before the break about Bitcoin Treasury companies, the hottest topic and trend in the industry. We've got Alexander Lize, CEO of Blockchain Group. They're trying to raise enough money to buy 1,000 Bitcoin. And we've got Nico Lechuga, founding partner at Ego Death Capital, here to bring a VC perspective to the conversation. So let's bring you in, Nico. Bitcoin Treasury companies have really kind of come out of seemingly nowhere. Michael Saylor pioneering this strategy 4 years ago, has been essentially buying Bitcoin by any means necessary, but this was an overlooked space for a long time. There weren't copycats. Now we're seeing a wave turn into a tsunami. What are you seeing in the market?
I think one of the really interesting things that we're seeing is there's a global game theory that's being played out. So it's being played out on the sovereign level. It's being played out with private companies. I think what we've had in the thesis in the private market was that we were interested in investing in companies that when they cash flow, they would cash flow Bitcoin. But what we're starting to see within the marketplace, and the hottest topic that you hit on right now, is other businesses that are keeping their treasury in Bitcoin, or other holdcos that are just going out and buying an incredible amount of Bitcoin and using the public markets to aggregate this finite asset. I think it's fundamentally interesting. I think to see the different strategies at play from here, we have an entirely new chessboard of different individuals that are playing at it. I'm really interested to see how it unfolds across different market conditions, as everybody seems to have their own unique playbook right now.
Right, I wanted to stick with you for a second just to talk about the companies that you're seeing. When you think about Ego Death Capital and the kind of startups we used to see funded in Bitcoin, maybe it was a Bitcoin Lightning startups, wallets, exchanges. These were for-profit businesses selling Bitcoin products and services. Now we're seeing companies almost capitalize first and then try to figure out the product later. What's your view on that?
So yeah, you do have certain companies that are saying like, hey, we're going to go out and raise an incredible amount of money and we're going to figure out the product. And these, I would think these would be your treasury companies. Really, like if we look at the SPAC model, if I'm going to raise a lot of money, I'm going to take this vehicle public and then I'm going to find some type of public company to de-SPAC into. This is more in the treasury focus from here. I think what we fundamentally invest in the private markets is that business that has a product or service that does have a future cash flow that will be Bitcoin. I think what we're seeing is those things are starting to come together. And there's going to be a whole host of new companies that you can invest in.
Alex, I want to go over to you. Obviously, you started the company last year, seen tremendous success. Are there advice, is there risks, concerns that you would have about companies entering now or potentially even later? Let's just say the United States does buy Bitcoin, start buying Bitcoin under the Bitcoin Act, buying 1 million Bitcoin. What kind of risks exist for Bitcoin treasury companies under that environment?
Well, the first risk for companies that are adopting Bitcoin is to not focus solely on Bitcoin. You need to focus on Bitcoin. The second risk is to not allocate all of your long-term capital to Bitcoin. And the third risk is literally to not focus on increasing Bitcoin per share over time. And that's the risk that you will have every day, because if you are not adopting Bitcoin, you are going to the ground as a stable coin. And then on the medium to long term, the risk is that you don't want to be playing with the Bitcoin. We get solicited every day by different companies that want us to play with the Bitcoin. They want us to do stacking. They want us to do thousands of things. And our answer is simple, it's no. And why? Because my time is much best time spent by raising capital, as much capital as possible, as fast as possible, and to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible on the balance sheet with the lowest risk possible. And
this is, I think, what some Bitcoiners, maybe Aaron was here earlier talking about, the risk of just taking on debt to buy Bitcoin. You don't see that as a risk.
So traditionally, if you take convertible debt with fiat, well, you are limited to 20 to 30% of the value of your Bitcoin stack. And that's what strategy has done. But still, with this, your risk is very limited because you are on a 5-year horizon. And so the risk you take is the fall of Bitcoin over a very prolonged time. So if you don't believe in Bitcoin, you don't buy Bitcoin treasury companies. But then what we did is we stripped away even this risk. We stripped it away by doing BTC-denominated convertible bonds out of Luxembourg with a specific SPV. And so the risk is completely segregated from the group, and it's actually less risky for the company and less risky for the investor. And that way we have been able to generate 800 plus BTC yield year to date.
You're about to hear from Vlad Tenev, CEO of Robinhood. The guests and speakers keep coming. Stay tuned here on YouTube, Rumble, and X.